Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Thank you, Darren, for being here.
Sure.
I had a moment a couple weeks ago where I was remembering my first time to Mobile World Congress in 2014 and walking through one of the halls in Barcelona in the conference center. It felt like there was some sort of thesaurus exercise going on where we were trying to find different ways to say digital transformation. And every company from Deloitte to Ericsson was working digital transformation into their taglines. And it occurred to me that everything since then has been sort of build up and false starts towards this digital transformation. And then in 9 months of the pandemic, it was here. And it felt like maybe that's not a bad thing. Often it takes a forcing mechanism, but it also reflects where we are with remote work. As one of the originals, GitLab is a remote by design company, first to go public, and as the head of remote, how do you do it? How'd you get out in front of this thing so quickly?
Well, like many things in life, change happens slowly, then suddenly. And I like to tell people that I've spent my whole career in distributed teams, and for 15 plus years, I felt like I was pushing a boulder straight up a mountain. And then COVID happens, and now that same boulder is just barreling through forest, wreaking havoc on the other side of it. Pros and cons, of course. GitLab got ahead of it because the founding team realized and had a deep conviction that remote was not a perk or a hurdle to overcome, but truly a competitive and strategic advantage if you saw it as that, and if it was leveraged as that.
And in this marketplace, as we just heard Nick talk, particularly in technology, it feels like implementing a flexible and more remote infrastructure from the outset is an advantage in the marketplace if you've decided that that's the type of, if your target team is in their 30s, not in their 20s, living in small apartments, if there are different ways that you can optimize flexible work schedule, that you can drive efficiencies, you can pay less money, you could even generate higher happiness and sentiment scores from your team. What are the systems that you guys put in place and that you continue to iterate on that make that possible?
Well, I think a key point in that, and Dr. Bloom shared this, is that hybrid is really hard. And I think it's just easy to kind of blow past that, but we actually really need to park on that. Hybrid is really hard. The core reason for that is if you embrace hybrid, and hybrid as defined as a subset is always or often in the office or a co-located space, and then a subset is always or often anywhere, remote by default, you are intentionally architecting at least 2 playing fields to administrate in your organization. So you're at least making life twice as hard. Whereas in an all-remote or an all-co-located arrangement, you have 1 playing field. So on the topic of DEI, people are more equal. They have easier, more equitable access to information if you're all remote. I like to say that if you're all on Slack together, everyone is 1 click away from everyone else. You don't have to get in the elevator or go up and down floors. It just changes how you think about that. And so the systems that you put in place are really key. And for GitLab, we architected all of our operations around the assumption that we would be officeless by design. You think about work very differently when you go into work and assume that no one will visit an office together. And we've seen how this has worked with co-located spaces. If you're starting a company in Chicago and you rent out a high-rise, you architect the space very intentionally to maximize productivity, proximity, fulfillment of the people in there. But what's been fascinating is that when a lot of companies were forced into remote, they did not put the same level of rigor around architecting their cloud workspace. The truth is, in a remote company, we have over 1,700 people in over 60 countries. We all work together in a space. It just looks nothing like any of the physical buildings in San Francisco or anywhere else. So we put intentionality, a cloud architect, if you will, around the design of every nuance of how work happens, how interactions happen, creating environments where innovation can be sparked. You have to be greatly intentional. And I think the intentionality is what's really missing for most organizations in this shift.
I think that's probably right. I can speak to my own experience 2 years ago when I started Data Protocol. I think I was the only person who opened an office during the pandemic, and it's just because I had to get out of my house. I was often in there just by myself, but it was also, I very much wanted to learn about the subject matter that I was sort of steeping myself in. The product design and the audience I knew well, but how to get to developers and how to support them in this very specific way, I felt like I couldn't learn virtually. I had to be around people and watch them do it. But 2 years later, most of that team is now remote by design because they're writers, right? Data Protocol is an online resource for software developers. It enables API builders and platforms to distribute content faster and in a better way. Think of like masterclass on a Linux terminal. And all of those words have to be written by somebody. All of the video we produce has to be done in a thoughtful way. And so it's like, no. The learning team can now work in New York and Charlotte and all these different places, and it works better that way. Whereas the production team has to be at the office because we point cameras at people. And being thoughtful from the outset, I think you would say, is what enabled GitLab to get so far ahead of the curve, and now to be sort of a beacon of, oh yeah, that's what we should be pursuing if that works for our business model. Is that right?
Absolutely. Well, it's like remote isn't an accident. And actually, this conversation tends to really grab people more if you replace the word remote with workplace operations. For a long time, people have associated remote as, oh, it's this thing that we just let people do. But really, our workplace operations are this way. And they were built for office first, with an office first mindset. And if you can make it work from home, good for you. But we're not going to re-optimize for a different space. We're seeing companies realize now that that doesn't really work at scale. It's a bit like showing up with steel cleats on a football pitch, thinking you're going to play on turf, and you show up and it's actually a beach soccer match. Like, you could kind of make that work, like the equipment kind of matches, but long term, being intentional about truly transforming your workplace operations to match the space where people are adds a lot more efficiency and engagement.
So let's unpack that just a little bit in terms of what you personally and what GitLab generally does in terms of best practices, leading practices to create less friction, to optimize, to put in place opportunities to drive innovation, to get folks together virtually, obviously, but also to do it in a way that feels organic, like bumping into somebody in the kitchen. What are some of those secrets to success?
So the first piece here, and by the way, I'll mention, we have codified this operating model, and we've called it TeamOps. And in GitLab fashion, it's open source, and we've shared it with the world. And so there's a TeamOps course that anyone here and whoever is listening can take for free, and we would love feedback on that. And the reason we did it is, number one, we needed to codify it for ourselves. The work that I do around TeamOps helps GitLab become a better remote organization. It helps us improve our operations as we scale. But we're going to do it in a way that we share it with the world, because the rest of the world needs this right now, and we can learn from other organizations. This is a very open source mentality, but it has served us well. So the first guiding principle of that is shared reality, and I would argue this is the most important. And what this is really rooted in is a first principle around communication. Civilizations have scaled themselves over time through the written word. If you visit a McDonald's in Beijing and one in Phoenix, there's a reason why a Big Mac tastes the same all over the world. It's not because people all over the world scheduled a ton of recurring meetings and got Zoom fatigue and we got it right. No, someone wrote it down. This is how you make this product. This is how you scale this knowledge around the world. And that seems so simple, but it is so difficult to do without intentionality. And so what we've seen is a lot of managers who were forced into remote and they weren't born in this environment have been approaching this in a very DIY fashion. And DIY management doesn't scale. You can make it work when the office is the glue, the Band-Aid for all of your subpar operations, but in a remote setting, the spotlight really comes through. So the first principle is shared reality. What systems can you put in place to make sure that there is, as uniform as possible, a shared reality, that people are communicating in the same places, in the same way, not to tell people exactly how they have to do their jobs. In fact, I would argue that remote enables more agency and autonomy. But you have to have some guardrails and guiding principles so that people feel safe being innovative within the rails.
Can you give me an example what those guidelines would look like?
The greatest example, the most tangible example at GitLab is our company handbook. Now, GitLab is unique. One of our values is transparency. Our whole company handbook is available to the public online, which is a bit extreme for some. But the point is, you can Google GitLab handbook and you'll see it. The handbook is our operating manual. Most companies think about a handbook as a wiki, which is mostly just a repository where policies go to get stale. But when you work handbook first, when the writing is the very fabric of how you operate, it totally changes the tenor and the seriousness around having that rigor around documentation. So when you join GitLab, of course, we tell you all the great things about working here, but we actually teach you how to be a better writer, how to actually codify and add information to this massive operating manual. That's big. And a lot of companies are still treating information and knowledge management more like a wiki and less like the actual heartbeat of their operations.
It's really, not to get too symbolic here, but the nature of GitLab in a DevOps way and the documentation and the structure as very sort of engineering first, right, is the other side of that is almost like tribal knowledge, right? The idea that the norms and the way an office moves in a very real way becomes a stand-in for documentation, that we leave at 5. That's not written down anywhere. It's just what time people leave. Right, and it's not, it's not on the door. This isn't a bank. It doesn't say open 9 to 5, but at 5, people are leaving. How did that happen? But if it's written down and it's documented, here are the hours where we expect people to be online, unless or except and all of these different components. I can see how that would really put up the foundational sort of touchstones that people would need to make better decisions about their time management.
And look, some of these things seem really small in a vacuum, but they stack up and compound to be very impactful. The secret here is making the implicit explicit. And you cannot possibly go too far in doing that. Anything that is implicit should be made explicit. Because if you just think, well, somebody will hang around this person long enough to pick up on this, in a remote setting, there's no guarantee that would happen. One thing that comes to mind that we do is we explicitly say in the handbook that in a video call, it's okay to look away. That's such a small thing, but it completely changes your experience in the workplace. If you go into a day of wall-to-wall meetings and you think there's this implied expectation that you have to be locked into a camera lens, that has very detrimental effects on your productivity, your health, your ability to just be a human. Something as simple as that. Whatever it is for your organization, making the implicit explicit, it's worth putting full-time effort before.
That's a good one. It's fascinating. We're going to do Q&A here in a few minutes, guys, so let's hold your questions till then, but we'll definitely take a bunch of them. The answer to this one may actually take the rest of this segment. What does this mean for society? What is the idea that we can live and work in different places, non-centralized, mean for culture, for society, for cities? What does that look like?
So I'll say, if you haven't picked up on this, I'm long remote work. I'm pretty bullish on this. I would say I'm an optimist on this. So take all of that into account. The current frontier of remote work is geographic independence. So COVID accelerated a trend that actually made us pretty good at driving business results decoupled from physical geography. That is a significant event. But the next frontier of remote work will unlock much more. That is decoupling business results from linear time. Time independence paired with geographic independence could completely transform how we look at growth and what is possible. This is going to require a lot of organizations to invest in their operations and look to asynchronous workflows instead of synchronous workflows. Now, of course, these are just two tools in the toolbox. You do need them both. It's not like one is always a replacement for the other. But when the world at large gets really good at driving productivity and driving business results without needing someone in any physical place or needing two people to be online at exactly the same time, the potential is enormous. And I think we'll see new tools, new companies that are built around this new framework, because it really was not possible at scale pre-COVID. But this global permission slip, this global understanding that we can do things differently is opening some very interesting doors.
It's also, I mean, obviously we're at Turing's conference, and I think that nobody does it better than they do, opens the door for a global workforce that is sort of the literal personification of the idea that talent is distributed evenly, but opportunity is not. And that if you can plug into that global workforce that is able to work literally around the clock, because it's around the globe, that they are flexible within their own pods and are not tied to a single location, you're talking about a fairly seismic shift in the way that we've worked for 160 years.
What's really interesting about this moment in time is it feels like we're pretty far into this, but really we're at the kind of awkward teenager phase of remote work, where organizations have survived COVID and they think, oh, we know how to do remote work, but for organizations that weren't built for this, they're now familiar with pandemic-induced work from home. That's not the same as intentionally designed remote work. The second and third order effects of this are even more fascinating. You look at trends like rural depopulation. So for centuries now, small and mid-sized towns have been eroded as people have flocked to major urban areas because that's where the opportunity was. And then that has all sorts of negative side effects. I think we're going to see a reversal of that, where people are going to go back to what they consider home. We can't overstate the importance of community on the other side of this. I actually think that our attention to community got stronger during COVID because we immediately realized how hard life was without it. So I think reversal of rural depopulation is just one of those elements that we'll see. I also think we'll see people really intentionally redesigning their lives, optimizing for something other than a commute to the office. I mean, think about how crazy this is. For decades, maybe centuries, people have optimized their lives for, what do I want to do with my life? And then they've just let an HR department tell them where their family has to be. That is absurd. If you say that out loud, that is wild for organizations that do knowledge work and can enable something differently. My wife and I were able to adopt a newborn at birth almost 4 years ago, and I look back at the adoption journey and I think it was so seamless and so easy compared to what it would have been had I been forced to live in a certain city, have to live my life around a 9 to 5. That is really powerful. So when you take tens of millions of people and you give them permission to redesign their lives, my assumption is they'll gain more fulfillment as they find their identity stack more fulfilled from things outside of work. And that will pour into work. That makes people more innovative, more engaged, more loyal to organizations that enable them to live that type of life.
So the positives are clear. As a native of northern Maine, where it was 14 degrees in my hometown last night, I'm not going back.
That's a little cold.
It's a little chilly, and it's only December. Okay, so why don't we, can't really see, do people have questions for Darren that we want to jump into? I think we've got one over here. If not, I've got plenty more, but go ahead.
Darren, what's up, man?
What's up, man?
So one of the biggest challenges that I see in the industry is a lack of standardization within the term remote. What does that mean to a company? What does that mean to a person who's looking for a job? What does that mean to a job board and the way that they filter? Huge admiration for GitLab for the way that you open source the terms and the things that you use, because I think that's really helpful. But how far are we from an industry being standardized around what remote means? And how far are we from people being able to say a term about remote work and all of us being on the same page?
You might not love this answer, but I don't know if we'll ever get there. But I do think the positive is COVID has forced organizations to be more clear about the language they use when advertising roles. Even think about the word hybrid. Hybrid probably means something different to most everyone in this room. But it has forced organizations to say, here's what our version of hybrid means. It means you have to be in the office Tuesdays and Wednesdays, and then you can work anywhere else the other days. And some companies would say hybrid means we'll keep a few offices open, visit if you want to, don't if you don't. Both companies would call that hybrid. So my expectation is organizations and individuals will need to get more clear about what remote and hybrid and these other terms mean in the context of their specific organization. I think that's more likely, that people get more clear about what it means to them versus a standardization of it. And the other wild card I'll throw out here is I think in 5 to 10 years, remote work will just be work. I don't actually know if we'll stop to throw that qualifier in. Think about something like the telephone now. We just call it a phone. Like, we get it. It's built on telephony. And there are other examples like this. But I do see this just becoming the norm. I don't think you'll put the genie back in the bottle. Work will only become more distributed as new technologies evolve and as people just get better at operating this way.
The digital transformation anecdote that I told earlier, I think is an apt comparison. We still don't know what that means. But in 2014, it was the byproduct of the world's leading companies eating a pile of tech debt in the '08 crash, is why everything needed to go, like, be in this different place, and we have to invest in a transformation. We still don't know what that means. Is that digitizing records? Is it putting things in the cloud? Is it hardening end to end? What are we talking about? And I think you're right. The nomenclature doesn't matter nearly as much as the commitment to living a principle rather than defining what that principle is.
I'd even say on the fully remote front, I mean, there's a big difference. When you come into GitLab as an all-remote organization, you know right from the onboard that we have built our operations around this, and we've been very intentional about this. And so the infrastructure that you get with it depends from company to company, but net, I think it's a positive if companies are more clear about who they are and what they have in place.
Another question? I can't see anything. Okay.
Darren, thank you for sharing your experiences. I think I'm also feeling pretty pro-remote right now in terms of how we look at building our teams. Just opens up a larger talent pool. One of the questions I've had, and maybe I'm still stuck in the old school way of thinking about it, is team building. When you have remote teams, how do you build that culture, that collaboration, that camaraderie between people? You can't be in the same place at the same time, right? Thanks.
Yeah, great question. I'll give you two answers to that. I really think you need both. One is in-person engagements. The best remote teams have formidable in-person strategies. In a co-located organization, you don't even need an in-person strategy. It just happens because people bump into each other in the building. So it was architected into the very fabric of the building. That was the in-person strategy. It's worth allocating budget to get people together on some sort of cadence. It will differ depending on the size of your company, the stage of your company, the comfortability with remote, et cetera. The bottom line is put an in-person strategy in place. There's no total replacement for getting people together on occasion. So we let people live where they want to live by default, and then we strategically bring them together at special moments that they really lean into and remember. The other side of that is that I believe the future of workplace culture will largely be built outside of the workplace. And this is a bit jarring because many organizations have ran toward more Zoom happy hours, more forced connection during COVID, and it just doesn't work. The real magic is realizing that if you have people in 60 countries all around the world, instead of a Zoom happy hour, allocate that same hour to deploy them into their local communities. Whatever matters to them, maybe it's volunteering in a food bank, reading in a local library. It's the same sunk cost, it's the same hour spent. But if everyone wears company swag and they take a selfie of themselves doing something amazing, first off, when you share that back, now everyone genuinely knows how to connect with other people. And secondly, you've created marketing. So I think you're going to have to think about connection and belonging very differently in a distributed space. And the companies are going to have to let go a bit of that power grab in order to get back what they actually want, which is an engaged workforce.
Anybody else? I've got one if you guys want to wait. I think I know the answer to this question, but I'd love to get your thoughts on it. One of the seemingly one of the more remarkable things that is inherent in remote is that you're eliminating some of the old school archetypes of relationships, or the sort of the ways that we think of leadership, and the sort of the hero personas of the people who are always in the office, or the really charming person that comes and talks to whatever. And instead you're opening the door for people to get the job done, and for leaders that are more thoughtful rather than more attentive, right? And that feels like a lot of progress. It feels like a way to be more inclusive of different personality types, as well as rounding out teams with an idea of eliminating heroes and making everybody more heroic, for lack of a better word.
One of the guiding principles in TeamOps is results focused. It's about the results and the outputs, not the inputs. And when you think about inputs, that's where you start veering into dysfunction and politics and presenteeism, all of these things that not only don't drive results, but actively sabotage results. And it's amazing how woven into the fabric of work that has become, because it's just so easy in the office. And it's almost awkward in a remote setting. Like, you almost have to be intentional to force that in, because remote is just so much more efficient by design. And I think that's a good thing. It's forcing leaders to, it's a bit uncomfortable. Like, if you've been managing in an office for 20, 30 years, suddenly doing it differently, that's hard. That's hard. And a lot of organizations need to tap their L&D departments to work on upskilling. This isn't something that people will just learn overnight. But yes, when you're focused on the results, it does enable you to just let your people live lives. And again, this goes back to the notion of control. It requires organizations to just say it out loud. The results are what matter, and we hope that you rethink that ratio of life and work. In your identity stack, work doesn't have to be the first and only thing. One of our operating principles is family and friends first and work second. This is another one of those things, making the implicit explicit. It's just very clear that is the priority, and it creates behaviors and incentives and motivations that we want as an organization.
Great. One more question. I think we have a couple minutes left. We're good? All right. Thanks, Max. Darren, thank you for your time. This was a great discussion. And you'll be around if anybody has side questions.
I'll be around. Happy to chat. Thanks
Wonderful.
all for attending.
Thanks all.